It was nearly midnight when I saw the light in the upstairs window of the house next door. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe someone had finally moved in. But the house had been empty for so long, the thought didn't stick. I told myself I'd ask around tomorrow, check with the neighbors, and went back to watching TV. But the light didn't go out. Hours later, when I passed by the window again, it was still on, and this time I noticed something else movement. A shadow flickered across the window, too fast to be natural. My breath caught as I stepped closer to the glass, peering through the darkness. Another shadow appeared, then another, their movements overlapping like a poorly synchronized dance. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. My eyes were glued to the figures. Their shapes unnatural, their outlines faintly blurred. And then, as if they knew I was watching, they all stopped. Every shadow turned, their heads tilted in unison, staring directly at me. My breath hitched as I stumbled backward, away from the window. The figures didn't move. Didn't blink if they even had eyes. They just stood there, their blurred silhouettes framed by the warm glow of the upstairs room. My stomach churned as their stillness pressed against me like a physical weight. It felt like they were waiting for me to do something. I tore my gaze away, my heart pounding in my chest, and tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe I was overtired. Maybe it was some kind of optical illusion or a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. For a moment, I stood frozen in the middle of my living room, trying to decide what to do. Call the police? No. What would I even say? That I saw shadows in an empty house. They'd think I was crazy. Maybe I should just shut the blinds and go to bed, pretend I hadn't seen anything. But then, the lights in the house flickered. It wasn't just the upstairs window this time. Lights blinked on and off throughout the entire house, illuminating empty rooms one by one. The kitchen, the living room, the hallway. I could see it all through the gaps in the curtains. My hands began to shake as I counted the rooms. 5, 6, 7. When the light stabilized, the shadows were gone. I let out a shaky breath, relief washing over me. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was just overtired and my mind was playing tricks on me. I stepped away from the window, rubbing my temples. It's fine, I told myself. It's nothing. But then a noise stopped me cold. A faint tapping sound, rhythmic and deliberate. It wasn't coming from my window, it was coming from outside, just beyond my front door. My chest tightened as I turned to face it, my pulse thundering in my ears. The tapping continued, soft and steady, like fingers drumming on the wood. I crept toward the door, every step heavier than the last. The tapping stopped as I reached the peephole. My throat tightened as I leaned forward, peering through the tiny glass. The porch was empty. No one was there. Relief was short-lived. As I turned back toward the living room, I caught a glimpse of movement. Through the window, the upstairs light in the house next door flickered again. And this time, there was only one shadow. It stood perfectly still, its head tilted, staring down at my house. The air in the room felt heavier, thicker, as though the shadow's gaze carried weight that pressed into my chest. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure in the window. Its head tilted, slightly as if it were studying me, its outline sharper now, more defined. This wasn't my imagination. I knew it wasn't. I reached for my phone with trembling hands, unlocking it with clumsy fingers. I didn't know who to call -911? A friend? But my hand froze when the shadow moved. It took a step back from the window. Slow, deliberate. Then it raised an arm, pointing directly at me. A shiver raced down my spine as my breath caught in my throat. My living room felt colder now, the shadows along my walls seeming to stretch and shift in response. The figure held the gesture, for what felt like an eternity, its arm stiff and unnatural, before dropping it and vanishing into the darkness of the house. I should have stopped watching. I should have pulled the blinds and locked every door. But something held me there, rooted to the spot. The lights in the house next door flickered again, this time illuminating the hallway. My stomach churned as I saw the shadow move toward the stairs. It wasn't alone anymore. Two more figures joined it, their movements disjointed, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. They climbed down the stairs in unison, each step echoing faintly across the quiet street. Though the sound couldn't possibly carry that far. My pulse raced as they approached the front door of the house, their heads snapping in unison to face me one last time before disappearing from view. I backed away from my own window, my mind screaming at me to run, to hide, to do something. But before I could, I heard it again, the tapping at my front door. This time it wasn't soft. It was deliberate, pounding. I held my breath, my legs trembling as I crept toward the door once more. The tapping stopped. Before I reached the peephole, replaced by a faint shuffling sound, like footsteps moving across my porch. My hands shook as I leaned forward, one eye pressed against the glass. At first I saw nothing. The porch was empty, just like before. But as I leaned back, movement caught the corner of my vision. I whipped my head to the side, peering through the living room window again. The three shadows were now standing in my yard. They weren't just watching anymore, they were coming closer. Slowly, deliberately, they moved across the grass, their heads tilted in unison, their steps unnaturally synchronized. Stumbled back, knocking over a lamp as I scrambled for my phone again. My fingers slipped as I tried to call for help, the screen blurring through my panic. When I looked up, the shadows were at my porch steps, their heads tilted upward as though looking for something, someone. My blood ran cold as I realized they weren't staring at the door anymore. They were looking up at the window of my bedroom. My stomach twisted as I followed their gaze. The window of my bedroom was dark, the curtains drawn tight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something there, something they could see that I couldn't. The pounding in my chest grew unbearable, my breath shallow and uneven as I tried to make sense of it all. The shadows moved again, their jerky, synchronized steps breaking the stillness. One climbed the porch stairs, its limbs bending unnaturally as it reached the door. The second moved toward the side of the house, disappearing around the corner. And the third, it simply stood in the yard, staring at me through the living room window. I froze. My phone buzzed in my hand, the emergency call finally connecting. Relief surged through me as I heard the operator's voice on the other end. 911. What's your emergency? I tried to speak, but my voice came out as a whisper. There's someone outside my house. They're trying to get in. Can you see them? The operator asked, their tone calm but urgent. Yes, I croaked. There. Shadows. The line went silent for a moment, the kind of silence that feels too heavy. Stay on the line, the operator said finally. Officers are on their way. Stay somewhere safe. Safe. Nowhere in my house felt safe anymore. As if in response to the call, the shadow on the porch raised its hand and knocked again, slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud. The sound echoed through the house, shaking the air around me. The knocking stopped, replaced by a scraping noise, as though its fingers were dragging down the wood. I backed away, gripping the phone like a lifeline, but when I turned toward the hallway, my blood ran cold. The second shadow, the one that had disappeared around the side of the house, was inside. It stood at the far end of the hall, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its form flickering like a bad signal on an old TV. My legs locked up, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. But I couldn't. The shadow stepped forward, the same deliberate, jerky movements as before. It was heading straight for me. Get out, I screamed, the words breaking free in a surge of desperation. My voice echoed through the empty house. But the shadow didn't stop. Its head twitched, turning slightly as though it were curious, amused, even. I stumbled back into the living room, the phone slipping from my hand as I collided with the coffee table. The sound of breaking glass filled the air as a lamp crashed to the floor, and for a brief moment, the room was bathed in darkness. Then, the lights flickered on again. All three shadows were inside now. One stood at the hallway entrance, its elongated form blocking my escape. The second emerged from the kitchen, its blurred edges shifting and stretching with every step. The third, it was right in front of me, so close I could feel the cold radiating off its formless body. I pressed myself against the wall, trembling as they closed in around me, their heads tilting in eerie unison. The whispers started then, faint at first, growing louder until they were a cacophony of overlapping voices. "You let us in," they said, their voices layered, broken, inhuman. "You watched us. Now we're watching you." The lights flickered again, plunging the house into darkness. When they came back on, the shadows were gone. But the whispers remained. The whispers seemed to crawl through the walls, vibrating in the air around me. My body shook. As I scrambled to my feet, clutching at the edge of the couch for balance. The house was still. Again, too still, yet the faint voices persisted, their overlapping tones weaving in and out of coherence. I snatched my phone off the floor, desperate to check the line. The call had disconnected, and my screen was frozen, the image distorted by faint, static-like lines. My fingers trembled as I tried to reset it, but the phone wouldn't respond. It was useless. A sudden thud echoed through the house, sharp and deliberate, like something heavy falling to my floor. I turned toward the sound, my breath hitching. It came from upstairs, my bedroom. My pulse thundered as I stared at the staircase, dreading what I might find. But I couldn't stay here. The walls seemed to hum with energy, the air pressing down on me like an invisible weight. The whispers grew louder as I moved, each step up the stairs slower than the last. When I reached the landing, the silence became unbearable, broken only by the faint creak as of the floorboards beneath my feet. The bedroom door was open. It hadn't been before. I stepped inside, the air cold and stale, the kind of chill that settled deep into your bones. My heart sank when I saw the window. The curtains had been drawn open, and standing on the other side of the glass was a single shadow. It wasn't outside anymore. It was inside the reflection. The figure didn't move, but its head tilted slightly, the faintest semblance of a smile forming at the edges of its blurred face. My stomach churned as I realized it wasn't watching the room. It was watching me. I stumbled back, tripping over the rug and falling hard onto the floor. The impact jarred me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It pressed its hand against the inside of the glass, and the lights flickered again. When they came back on, the reflection was gone, but the shadow wasn't. Could be. It stood at the edge of the bed, its blurred edges sharpening with each flicker of the lights. My back hit the wall as I tried to push myself away, my breath coming in panicked gasps. The whispers grew deafening, overlapping voices clawing at my mind. "You let us in," the shadow said again, its voice clear now, resonant and mocking. "Now we'll stay." The lights flickered off once more, plunging the room into darkness. When they came back on, the shadow was gone. The whispers were gone. The room was empty. But the house didn't feel empty. The next morning, I tried to leave. I packed a bag, threw my phone in my pocket, and walked out the front door without looking back. But the moment I stepped onto the street, I froze. The windows of the house next door were dark again, lifeless as they had always been. But as I turned to look at my own house, my stomach dropped. Through the upstairs window, my bedroom window, a shadow stood, its head tilted, watching. Ever had a moment where you felt watched in your own home? We'd love to hear your creepiest experiences. It wasn't the first time I'd woken up in the middle of the night, but this felt different. My eyes opened, and for a moment, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. Then I saw it. The clock beside my bed glowed faintly 3:33 a.m. The sight sent a shiver through me, though I couldn't explain why. The air felt cold, unnaturally. And I swore I heard something faint, a rhythmic ticking, too slow to match the clock. I stared at the numbers, my chest tightening, before pulling the blanket over my head and forcing myself to sleep. When I woke up, the clock was blinking 12 a.m., its flashing light like a silent alarm. The unease clung to me, refusing to let go. The unease followed me through the day, a quiet nagging in the back of my mind. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Electronics glitch all the time. But no matter how much I rationalized, I couldn't shake the memory of that ticking sound, so faint and deliberate, or the unnatural cold that seemed to settle in my room. It wasn't just the clock, it was the way everything felt off. That night, I lingered downstairs, reluctant to go to bed. I kept busy, scrolling through my phone, cleaning dishes that didn't need scrubbing, even checking the locks on the doors twice. Anything to delay returning to my room. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I forced myself to climb under the covers, setting my alarm and double-checking the time before closing my eyes. But just like the night before, I woke up suddenly. My chest felt heavy, like the air in the room was pressing down on me. The clock's glow caught my attention immediately, 3:33 a.m. My breath hitched. It wasn't just the time that sent a chill through me, it was the stillness, the absence of even the faintest hum of the heater or the creak of the house settling. The room was unnervingly silent, except for that sound again. A slow, rhythmic ticking, steady and deliberate, coming from somewhere nearby. This time I didn't pull the blanket over my head. I sat up, my eyes scanning the room. The shadows seemed different, darker, stretching farther than the faint red light of the clock should allow. My skin prickled as I turned toward the corner of the room, where the sound seemed loudest. Nothing was there. Is there? The ticking stopped suddenly, as if it had never been there at all. I swallowed hard, lying back, down and squeezing my eyes shut, but it took hours before sleep returned. When I finally opened my eyes, it was morning, the sunlight spilling across the floor. I sighed in relief, but the moment was short-lived. The clock was blinking again, the relentless 12 a.m. flashing at me like a warning. This time I noticed something else, the faintest trace of condensation on the clock's surface, like it had been sitting in a freezer. My fingers brushed it, the plastic casing cold to the touch. This wasn't a glitch. It wasn't random. And I knew, without a doubt, it would happen again. By the third night, I was desperate for answers. I unplugged the clock, convinced the problem was electrical. But when the ticking started, and I woke up to 3:33 a.m. glowing on the unplugged display, I realized this wasn't something I could explain away. Whatever was happening was tied into more than just the clock. That evening, I decided to stay awake. I sat on the edge of my bed with my phone in hand, the soft glow of the screen the only comfort in the encroaching darkness. I kept the clock unplugged. Yet I couldn't help glancing at it, half expecting it to turn on by itself. Hours passed, the silence in the room deepening, until it was almost suffocating. At 3:30 a.m., the air shifted. It wasn't the heater kicking on or a draft from the window, it was something else, something I couldn't see. The darkness in the corners of the room seemed to thicken, curling inward like smoke. My skin prickled as the ticking sound returned, slow and deliberate, like a metronome counting down. Tick, tick, tick. I held my breath as the room grew colder, the frost-like chill creeping along my arms. Then, as if on cue, the unplugged clock flickered to life. The numbers glowed bright red, 3:33 a.m. The ticking stopped. That's when I saw it. The shadows weren't just darker, they were moving. At first it was subtle, like a faint ripple in the corner of my vision. But as I stared, the shapes grew more distinct, stretching upward. twisting into forms that resembled human figures. They hovered just at the edges of the room, or watching. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out every other sound. One of the figures stepped forward, its movement slow, deliberate, as if testing the space. The faint red glow of the clock illuminated its edges tall, spindly, and impossibly thin. Its head tilted, as though it were studying me. The shadows in the corners began to close in, their forms multiplying, pressing against the walls, and stretching toward the bed. I wanted to scream, to run, but my voice caught in my throat. Hands trembled as I gripped the blanket, the only barrier between me and them. The figure closest to me raised a hand, its fingers impossibly long and sharp, and pointed at the clock. My eyes followed the gesture. The red numbers began to flicker, shifting erratically before resetting to 12 a.m. The clock went dark, plunging the room into blackness. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of someone standing inches from me. A cold breath brushed against my cheek, and a voice, barely more than a whisper, broke the silence. "You're late." The room exploded with sound, a deafening chorus of ticking, whispers, and distorted laughter. I bolted from the bed, stumbling toward the light switch, but when I flipped it on, nothing happened. The shadows remained, thicker and darker than before, their forms pulsating like they were alive. The ticking slowed, and the whispers quieted, leaving only a single voice, deep and resonant, echoing through the room. "We're not done yet." The voice resonated in my chest, low and guttural, each word reverberating as if the walls themselves were speaking. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I pressed myself against the farthest corner of the room, trying to put as much distance as possible between me and the shifting figures. The shadows seemed alive, writhing along the walls, their spindly forms stretching unnaturally, bending and breaking in ways that defied logic. I clutched the edge of the blanket, desperate for anything that felt real, but it was useless. The darkness pressed closer, suffocating, until the entire room seemed consumed. Only the faint red glow of the clock remained, 3:33 a.m. burning through the void like an unholy beacon. "What do you want from me?" I finally managed to choke out, my voice cracking under the weight of the terror gripping me. The shadows paused, their movements freezing in eerie synchronization. The air shifted again, colder now, as though I had said the wrong thing. The ticking returned, louder this time, echoing, in a rhythm that didn't belong to my clock or any clock I'd ever heard. Tick, tick, tick. The figure nearest to me stepped forward, its form solidifying. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its head was featureless, smooth and blank, yet I could feel its gaze, heavy and unrelenting. It raised a hand, its fingers impossibly sharp, and pointed directly at my chest. "You opened the door," the voice whispered, layered and broken, as if spoken by many mouths at once. "You let us in." "I didn't." I began, but the voice interrupted, louder now, and filled with malice. "You brought the time." And the clock's numbers flickered violently, glitching and flashing, until the red glow shifted to an eerie, pulsating white. The brightness illuminated the room for a brief moment, and I saw them. All dozens of shadowy figures, crowded in every corner, their heads tilted as they stared at me, or with impossible stillness. A chill ran down my spine as I realized something horrifying. They weren't just standing in my room, they were waiting. Waiting for what I asked, my voice trembling. My words felt hollow, lost in the cacophony of the ticking, which had grown deafening. My chest tightened as the lead figure stepped closer, the shadows behind it twisting and writhing like serpents. "For you to remember," it hissed. "Remember what?" I shouted, my voice breaking. The cold was unbearable now, seeping into my skin, freezing me to the core. My mind raced, trying to piece together any explanation, but there was nothing. No answers. Only fear. The figure reached out, its spindly hand brushing the side of my face. It didn't feel solid, its touch was cold, like smoke and ice, but it sent a shock of images racing through my mind. Fragmented memories, broken and incomplete, flashed before me. The ticking in the room, slowed, syncing with the flashes in my head. A house. A locked door. A clock. Something I had forgotten, buried deep in my subconscious, began to resurface. I had seen this. Before this moment, this time 3:33 a.m. It wasn't just random. It was tied to something. Something I had done. No, I whispered, shaking my head. I don't understand. The lead figure tilted its head, as if mocking my confusion. The red glow of the clock began to shift again, the numbers spinning wildly before settling on a time I didn't recognize: 0. The voice returned, louder, filling the room with a resonance that made my teeth ache. The time has come. The figure surged forward. I screamed, stumbling backward, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows enveloped me, their coldness suffocating as they pulled me into the darkness. The room dissolved around me, replaced by an endless void. The ticking was all I could hear, steady and relentless. I don't know how long I floated in that nothingness: seconds, hours. The concept of time had evaporated, leaving me suspended in an endless, freezing void. But then, without warning, the ticking stopped. I landed hard on something solid. The impact jarred me, and I gasped, my lungs burning as I sucked in air. I opened my eyes, blinking against the blinding light of the room around me. I was back. My bedroom looked exactly as it had before, the clock glowing softly on the nightstand. 12 a.m. For a moment, I thought it was over. Just a nightmare, I told myself. A terrifying, vivid nightmare. Destinier. But then I noticed the clock. Its glow was wrong, colder than before. I reached out with trembling fingers, hesitating just above its surface. The chill radiating from the device was unnatural, almost unbearable. The moment my skin brushed the clock, a faint whisper echoed in the room. You're late. I jerked back, my heart pounding as the shadows in the corners of the room began to stir once again. The clock's display flickered, and my stomach dropped as the numbers shifted. 3:33 a.m. The whisper grew louder, echoing in my ears. This time, there's no going back. I bolted from the room, racing down the hallway, but no matter how far I ran, the walls seemed to close in, bending and warping, as if the house itself was alive. The whispers followed, growing louder, layered with mocking laughter. I reached the front door, yanking it open, only to be greeted by the same icy void I had been trapped in before. The ticking returned, slower now, deliberate, as though mocking my attempts to escape. I stepped back into the house, shaking uncontrollably. There was no escape. The shadows had followed me, their forms pressing against the walls surrounding me. The lead figure emerged. From the darkness, its head tilted, its faceless gaze fixed on me. You brought the time, it said, its voice impossibly calm. Now it's ours. The clock on the wall chimed loudly, though it didn't display any numbers. Its face was blank, yet its ticking filled the room, marking each passing second with a finality I couldn't ignore. Stumbled backward, falling to my knees as the figures closed in. The last thing I saw was the clock resetting itself, its numbers glowing faintly as they returned to the inevitable. 3:33 a.m. Have you ever had a moment where time seemed wrong? Tell us. Your scariest encounters with the unexplained. The day felt colder than it should have. Even though the sun was shining, a chill clung to the air, cutting through my jacket as I made my way toward her grave. It had been months since I'd visited, though I'd thought about it often. Guilt weighed on me like a stone, and I couldn't help but wonder if she'd be disappointed in me for staying away. The cemetery was empty, just rows of stone markers and a faint rustle of leaves. As I turned down the path toward her grave, I stopped abruptly. There was someone sitting there. The figure was motionless, perched on the headstone as though they belonged there. I squinted, trying to make out who it was. Maybe a stranger? A mourner who'd gotten the wrong grave. But something about the way they sat, the way they held themselves, felt eerily familiar. As I stepped closer, my heart began to race. The figure turned slightly, and that's when I saw it, the unmistakable curve of her face, the way her hair fell over her shoulder. It was her, my friend, sitting on her own grave, staring into the distance as if nothing was wrong. My knees felt weak as I froze in place, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it echoed across the empty cemetery. It couldn't be her. It shouldn't be her. Every logical part of my mind screamed that this wasn't possible, but my eyes couldn't deny what they saw. Lizzie, I whispered, the name barely escaping my lips. The figure didn't move at first. She remained perfectly still, her face turned toward the horizon, her hands resting on her knees. She looked serene, almost peaceful, but something about her stillness was unnerving. It wasn't natural. It reminded me of a statue, too perfect, too rigid, as though she wasn't meant to move at all. Lizzie, I said again, louder this time, the word catching in my throat. This time she turned, slowly, deliberately. Her movements were unnaturally fluid, like watching someone move underwater. My breath caught as her face came fully into view. It was her, the same soft smile, the same knowing eyes, the same outfit she'd worn that day, the day of her funeral. The day we lowered her into the ground. You came, she said, her voice soft, almost musical. It didn't echo like it should have in the stillness of the cemetery. Instead, it seemed to settle in the air between us, as though she'd whispered it directly into my ears. My words faltered as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. This isn't real. You're gone. Her smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. They stayed fixed on mine, unblinking, as though she were studying me. I've been waiting for you, she said, tilting her head slightly. I thought you'd never come back. My stomach churned, guilt and confusion warring with the primal urge to run. This can't be happening, I muttered, more to myself than to her. You're not, this isn't, oh. Why didn't you visit sooner, she interrupted, her tone light but laced with something sharper, something that sent a shiver down my spine. My throat tightened. I thought about it. Life's been busy, she finished for me, her smile fading as her head tilted further, unnaturally, far. Her voice, though soft, carried an edge now. Too busy to visit an old friend. The air around me grew colder. The sunlight that had warmed the cemetery just moments ago seemed to dim. I took a step back, clutching the bouquet in my hands like it was some kind of shield. Lizzie, I don't understand. How are you? Here, she said, standing now. Her movements were smooth, almost too smooth, as though she were weightless. Her feet didn't even disturb the grass beneath her. You brought me back. No, I shook my head, panic bubbling in my chest. I didn't. What are you talking about? I didn't do anything. She stepped closer, her expression darkening, though her smile never wavered. Oh, but you did, she said, her voice almost a whisper. You left me here. You forgot about me. My breath came in shallow gasps as she stopped just a few feet away. Her eyes weren't the soft brown I remembered, they were darker now, deeper, like the endless void of a night with no stars. Lizzie, please, I begged, my voice trembling. I didn't forget. You let me go, she said, her voice dripping with quiet accusation. And now I can't leave. The bouquet slipped from my hands, the flowers scattering at my feet. My legs felt like they might give out as the edges of her form began to ripple, her once soft features shifting subtly, becoming sharper, more angular. Stay, she said, her voice dropping to a low, guttural tone that sent a jolt of terror through me. Stay with me. Stay with me. The shadows around her seemed to stretch, reaching toward me like living things. I stumbled. Backward. The chill in the air biting at my skin. Lizzie. I'm sorry, I cried, tears streaming down my face. I didn't mean to leave you. Her smile widened unnaturally, splitting her face in a way no human expression should. You can make it right, she said, her voice a distorted echo now. Stay with me. The shadows surged forward, and the world seemed to tilt, the ground shifting beneath me as the air was pulled from my lungs. I turned and ran, the graveyard spinning around me, her voice echoing in my ears. You can't leave me, she screamed, her voice high and fractured, like glass shattering. Not again. I ran blindly, the uneven gravel path of the cemetery crunching beneath my feet. The cool, crisp air that had greeted me earlier now felt heavy and suffocating. My legs burned as I sprinted toward the gates, my heart pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. But her voice, Lizzie's distorted, fractured voice pierced through the chaos. You can't leave, she screamed, the sound warping and echoing unnaturally, as though it were chasing me. Come back. Stay with me. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and my stomach lurched. Lizzie wasn't sitting on her grave anymore. She was standing just behind me, her movements unnaturally smooth, as if the ground didn't exist beneath her feet. Her form rippled slightly, as though she weren't entirely solid. Her arms stretched forward, her fingers unnaturally long and sharp, clawing at the air between us. The once familiar face I had loved was now contorted into something monstrous, her smile too wide, her eyes burning black and endless. Please, I shouted, choking on my own breath as I stumbled over a loose stone. Lizzie, I'm sorry. I didn't mean. You left me, she roared, her voice shattering into a chorus of distorted cries. The shadows around her stretched out, latching onto the gravestones in the ground, clawing toward me like living tendrils. Esh. I reached the cemetery gates and shoved them open, the rusted metal creaking loudly in protest. The world outside the graveyard was eerily still, the streetlights flickering as I sprinted to my car. My shaking hands fumbled with the keys as I glanced back. She stood just inside the gates, her form flickering like a distorted reflection in a broken mirror. Her head tilted slowly to the side, that grotesque smile still splitting her face. The shadows around her pulsed and writhed like living creatures, and her voice echoed again, softer now but no less terrifying. You'll be back, she whispered. You can't leave me forever. I threw myself into the car, locking the doors and starting the engine. The headlights illuminated the empty road ahead, but my eyes remained fixed on the rearview mirror. Lizzie was still there, standing in the middle of the cemetery, her figure barely visible in the growing darkness. As I drove away, her voice echoed in my mind, a faint, haunting whisper that refused to let me go. I didn't sleep that night, even after locking every door and turning on every light in my house. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence heavier. I stayed on the couch, my knees pulled to my chest, flinching at every creak and groan of the house. Her voice, her twisted smile, played on an endless loop in my head. You'll be back. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been a nightmare. I'd been overtired, overwhelmed by guilt and grief. But when I looked at the bouquet I'd dropped in the cemetery, now inexplicably lying on my doorstep, my blood ran cold. The flowers were withered, their petals blackened and crumbling as though they'd been scorched. A faint smell of burnt earth clung to them, filling the air around me. My shaking hands dropped them, and I stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut. For the next few days, I avoided the cemetery entirely. I ignored the calls of guilt in the back of my mind and drowned myself in distractions, trying to pretend the encounter had never happened. But Lizzie wouldn't let me forget. Every night at 3:33 a.m., I woke to the sound of her voice, faint but insistent, whispering my name. The shadows in my room seemed to stretch unnaturally, pulling at the edges of the walls. My reflection in the mirror felt wrong, like it wasn't following my movements perfectly. The air grew colder, the same bone-deep chill I'd felt in the cemetery. And then the dream started. In every dream, I was back at the graveyard, standing before her headstone. Lizzie was there, sitting on it, her twisted smile fixed on me. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows began to close in, pulling me toward her. "You'll stay this time," she'd say, her voice soft and mocking. "We'll be together again." Each time I woke drenched in sweat, gasping for air, the echoes of her laughter ringing in my ears. I couldn't take it anymore. The guilt, the whispers, the shadows, it was all too much. I found myself back at the cemetery one evening, clutching a lantern and a bundle of white flowers. My heart pounded as I walked the familiar path toward her grave. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the headstones. As I reached her plot, I froze. Lizzie was already there, sitting on the grave just as she had been before, her smile wide and expectant. "I knew you'd come back," she said, her voice light, almost teasing. Her form rippled faintly in the dim light, the edges of her figure blending with the shadows. "Lizzie," I said, my voice trembling, "what do you want from me?" She tilted her head, her smile fading as her eyes bore into mine. "I want what you owe me," she said, her tone cold and sharp. "You left me, you forgot me, and now you'll stay." The shadows around her surged forward, lashing out like claws. I stumbled backward, clutching the lantern as the air grew colder, the light dimming. Lizzie stood, her form twisting and elongating as her voice echoed around me. "You'll stay," she hissed. "Forever." I ran, but the shadows followed, her voice ringing in my ears. I didn't look back. I couldn't. And I haven't been back since. But every night I feel her presence, hear her whispers, and see the shadows stretching closer. Lizzie hasn't left me, and deep down, I know she never will. Days passed, and Lizzie's presence grew stronger. The whispers no longer waited for nightfall. They followed me everywhere. In the car, at work, even in crowded spaces, I could feel her eyes on me, hear her faint, mocking laughter in my ears. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. The shadows around me seemed to stretch unnaturally, no matter how bright the room was. I knew I couldn't keep running. I had to end it. I spent hours scouring old folklore and obscure forums, desperate for anything that might explain what was happening. Stories of restless spirits, guilt-fueled hauntings, and unfinished business filled my screen. One phrase caught my attention sometimes: "The dead linger because the living are holding them here." My stomach churned as I thought about it. Could it be true? Was Lizzie here because of me? The only way to end a haunting, the article said, was to confront the spirit and give it what it wanted or sever the connection entirely. My hands trembled as I realized what that meant. I had to go back to the graveyard. I had to face her. The air was colder than I remembered, biting at my skin as I stepped into the cemetery. The lantern in my hand flickered weakly, the light barely cutting through the encroaching darkness. The path to Lizzie's grave seemed longer, the shadows between the headstones deeper. Every step felt heavier, like the ground itself was pulling me down. When I reached her grave, I wasn't surprised to see her there, perched on the headstone. She was waiting, just as she'd been before. Her smile was wider now, splitting her face in a way that made my stomach churn. Her hair rippled, though there was no breeze, and her eyes glowed, faintly in the dim light. "You came back," she said, her voice soft but dripping with malice. "I knew you would." "Lizzie," I said, my voice shaking. "Why are you doing this? What do you want from me?" Her smile faded, and for a moment she looked almost like the friend I remembered. "I want what you promised," she said, her tone cold. "I want you to stay." "I never promised you anything," I shouted, anger bubbling up alongside my fear. "You're gone, Lizzie. You're not supposed to be here." Her expression twisted, her eyes narrowing as her form flickered, the edges of her body blurring into the shadows. "You left me," she hissed, her voice deepening. "You forgot me. You let me rot here alone. The lantern in my hand flickered, the light dimming as the shadows around her surged forward. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't forget you, I shouted. I've been carrying the guilt every day. I'm sorry. She paused, her head tilting slowly, unnaturally. Sorry, she repeated, her voice dripping with mockery. Do you think sorry is enough? The shadows lashed out, wrapping around my legs and pulling me toward her. My screams were swallowed by the icy darkness as Lizzie's face twisted into something monstrous, her mouth stretching unnaturally wide, her voice reverberating in my mind. You owe me, she said, her words echoing as the shadows pressed tighter. And now you'll stay. Through the suffocating cold, a single thought broke through the panic. I had to let her go. Whatever connection had kept her here, whatever guilt had tethered her spirit to me, I had to sever it. It was the only way. I release you, I screamed, my voice cracking. Lizzie, I let you go. I'm sorry for everything. But you can't stay here anymore. You can't stay with me. The shadows recoiled, the grip on my legs loosening as Lizzie's form flickered violently. Her expression contorted, her eyes burning with rage and pain. You can't leave me, she wailed, the sound splitting the air like shattering glass. You can't let me go. I have to, I said, tears streaming down my face. You're gone, Lizzie. It's time for you to rest. Her scream pierced the air, the shadows around her spiraling wildly before collapsing inward. Her form twisted, breaking apart like smoke caught in a gale. The air around me grew colder. Still, freezing my breath as I watched her dissolve, her voice fading into a faint whisper. Don't forget me. Aithe. And then she was gone. The graveyard fell silent, the stillness almost deafening. I sank to my knees, the lantern's light flickering weakly beside me. My chest heaved as I gasped for air, my hands trembling uncontrollably. The weight that had pressed down on me for weeks was gone, but it left behind a hollow ache. I left the cemetery without looking back. The whispers, the shadows, the unnatural chill, they were gone. But Lizzie's voice, her final words, stayed with me. Back at home, I placed a picture of us on the mantel, lighting a small candle beside it. I whispered a quiet apology, my voice barely audible over the flickering flame. I haven't seen Lizzie since that night, but sometimes late at night, I feel a faint chill pass through the room. And when I glance at her picture, I swear the smile in the photograph is just a little softer, a little more forgiving. Lizzie is gone, but I'll never forget her. What would you do if someone you lost suddenly appeared before you? Share your thoughts or similar chilling experiences in the comments below.